Bob Lazar claims to have examined an alien craft at S4, a subsidiary facility he says existed near the Nellis Air Force Base installation, better known as Area 51. According to Lazar, this craft ran on an antimatter reactor powered by element 115, which at the time had not yet been synthesized. Join myself and Neil as we discuss the claims made by Bob Lazar that he was recruited to reverse engineer flying saucer technology.
Aliens Explored is a weekly podcast exploring famous and obscure cases of UFO sightings, alien abductions and other strange events from both a believing and a skeptical perspective whilst keeping an open mind. I'm Stu Jackson, a professional actor and amateur ufologist with a particular interest in the crop circle phenomenon. I'll be debating that otherworldly visitations are real. The truth is out there.
And I'm Neil Kelly. I'm a professional actor as well and used to work for the military as an intelligence analyst. I'll be arguing from a more doubtful point of view. I mean, it's all a bit far-fetched, isn't it?
Hello listeners and welcome back to another episode of Aliens Explored with me, Stu Jackson,
And with me, Neil Kelly.
and this week we are talking about a very controversial figure in ufology terms, Bob Lazar. Now, there's so much to unpack about him. What was your take looking at the Bob Lazar case, Neil?
Well, what I know about Bob Lazar is that he, Wikipedia describes him as an American conspiracy theorist who claims to have been hired in the late 1980s to reverse engineer purported extraterrestrial technology at a secret site called S4 in Area 51. We know about Bob Lazar that he is he's a bit of a fake as regards his academic record. He claims degrees from universities apparently have no knowledge of him, and supposed former workplaces that have disavowed him. He has criminal convictions. He was arrested for aiding and abetting a prostitution ring, which was reduced to a charge of felony pandering, and he and his wife were also done for violating the Federal Hazardous Substances Act for shipping restricted chemicals across state lines. So yes, why are we talking about Bob Lazar?
Well, let's unpack sort of each of those, not necessarily in turn, because the first thing you mentioned was his credentials, his claim that he's got these degrees from MIT and Caltech in electronics and physics.
Yes.
And yes, it's very interesting they allegedly have no record of him. I agree, that one is an interesting one. However, there is testimony from people who knew Bob at the time who've said, of course he was going to Caltech. Yes, of course he was going to MIT. I used to drop him off and pick him up on occasion.
Did they really?
So you've got actual testimony of that. Beyond that, there is absolutely no evidence. I agree. However, you also mentioned his employer, and I'm assuming you're referring there to Los Alamos.
Yes, who said they had he said they had no knowledge. They said they had no knowledge of him. That's it. His supposed employment at Nellis Air Force Base, Roswell, or the Nellis Air Force Base subsidiary, has also been discredited, as well as by the United States Air Force itself.
Okay, well, we'll come back on to Nellis and the whole S4 Area 51, but looking at Los Alamos, now that I find fascinating because, yes, they say we've got no record of the guy, we've no idea who he is, and they were very, very vehement about that at the time when all this happened. We're talking very late 80s, early 90s, when they were questioned about it. However, a newspaper article from 1982 surfaced talking about Los Alamos and this jet car that they had created, and it cites Bob Lazar as one of the physicists who helped make it.
Yes, it was in the Alamogordo Daily News. Featured Lazar's jet-powered car, which reportedly achieved speeds of 200 miles an hour. And that article described him as a physicist at the Los Alamos Meson Physics Facility. However, the Los Alamos National Laboratory has disavowed him.
Yes, which is which is true.
Well, Lazar says that his records have been erased, but some skeptics such as Donald R. Prothero, Stanton T. Friedman and Timothy D. Callahan, all got their American middle initials, say that this is implausible.
Well, if they say it's implausible, then, it must be.
Prothero said that he was employed, but not by the government, but rather as a technician working for a private company that contracted work at Los Alamos. Well, that kind of thing, subcontracting to private companies, has been going on for decades. It is quite probable. He might have, if he's being truthful, yes, he might have just said, well, yes, I'm working for the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is true, but actually, strictly speaking, if you want to be accurate, he's working for a company that is subcontracted to the Los Alamos.
Okay,
so that
and could be. I can absolutely accept that, but they would also have a record of all the subcontractors that have worked for them.
Well, the Los Alamos National Laboratory wouldn't have done. They'd have had a record of the firms that they've subcontracted to, but not the employees of those firms. You'd have to go to those individual firms to get the names of the employees, and even they might have been subcontractors who are not employed directly by them.
Many moons ago, I used to work in the automotive industry, and I was a manager for them. And we used to use subcontractors all the time, and subcontracting companies, and we'd use subcontracting engineering companies who would then subcontract, and so you'd get this sort of multi-tiered contracting thing going on. But as training manager, I knew the name of every single subcontractor who walked through that door, and I had a record because I had to give them an induction, I had to show them around the site, I had to show them where the loos were, amongst obviously more serious things like all the health and safety, but we had to have records that we had run them through the health and safety. If nothing else, that we'd shown them where the fire exits are.
Yeah, presuming that they
had to have that record.
Yeah, presuming that they worked on your site. If they were working somewhere else for that company, doing work that was related to your area, but they don't ever have cause to come to your building, then you wouldn't know their name.
Okay, but in fact we had satellite sites up in Derby.
But they might not even have gone to your. They might not even have worked at one of your satellite sites. They could have been working on a project on one of their direct employers' sites, producing something which then is provided to you.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. I worked in the NHS on the National Project for IT, and this was a real bonanza for the big boys. I mean, BT were involved, AT&T were involved, all sorts of companies. This National Project for IT. It was the most expensive IT project in the history of this country. I think in the history of the world at the time. Well, I've no idea who AT&T employed or or IBM or BT or all these other companies. And these people would never have come to our site. We just accepted the results of their labour.
I just find it hard to believe that the NHS wouldn't have a record. You might not personally, but the NHS as an organisation would have a record of who was working on the project, surely. No, because it's kind of... Or any medical supplies company, say Pfizer or GlaxoSmithKline Beecham, they wouldn't have a list of all their employees in the NHS. Yeah, they would know, yes, we've subcontracted this company, and if you approach that company within the bounds of confidentiality or what they wanted to release, they could tell you who'd worked on something, but the NHS wouldn't necessarily know, just as... I mean, I know there are more security issues with this, but even so, with subcontracting, it's that the end user can't say at all that they know every single person who worked on it. They know every person who came onto their site. They know every company, but they might even know the subcontractors to those companies, but they wouldn't know the actual people. So what I'm saying is, Bob Lazar's it's credible that he could have been working for a subcontracting. All right, and I can accept all that, but let's tie that in for a moment into his qualifications. Even if he was working as a subcontractor, working on a jet car project as a physicist or a technician, he'd have to have some pretty impressive qualifications to do that.
You would think, wouldn't you? I mean, let's say Lazar claims to have earned a master's degree in physics from the from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a master's degree in electronic technology from the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. So those are high-flying degrees. Why would those institutions deny that someone had earned a master's degree with them? Why would they say we've never heard of him?
Okay, as a motive, under government pressure. I mean, you've got to believe that these organisations rely on government funding.
They
do. They were told very specifically by, Men in Black or whatever.
I don't see why they would. Even if someone goes on uses this education to go and work on the most top secret government project. The government might deny all knowledge of this guy. They might swear him to secrecy and all that, but I don't think they'd go back down the line and go back to his schools and say, you never heard of this guy, right? He doesn't exist.
Well, yeah, it'd be a great way to discredit him. Well, now, there's another element to this, and you mentioned about his criminal conviction, and particularly the one related to prostitution.
Yeah.
Now, when all that came out and he stood there in court and he lists off these qualifications again, MIT, Caltech, as part of his life history. Now, of course, the courts have a legal duty to check these things out. There's no record of it, and the judge is there telling him, we can't find a record of it. Either you tell us the truth or you are going to jail. Now, that is the time to come clean. Bear in mind, his life's already been ruined by all this UFO nonsense at this point in his life.
Has it been ruined?
That is the time to come clean. Oh, God, yes. I mean, he's living now a quite happy, low-profile life, or as low-profile as he can, doing what something he loves. So his life is now happy. But at the time, nobody would touch him with a 10-foot pole. He couldn't get work anywhere.
Well, I mean, just looking at the timeline of this, in May 1989, this is when he appeared in an interview with an investigative reporter, George Knapp, on, was it
George Knapp, yeah.
How do they pronounce it? Knapp.
Yeah, Knapp. It's George Knapp.
On a Las Vegas TV station, KLAS.
Yeah.
He used the pseudonym Dennis, and his face was hidden, and that's where he discussed his purported employment at S4, the subsidiary facility he claims exists, which is near Area 51.
Yeah.
It was only the following year that he was arrested for aiding and abetting a prostitution ring. So,
yes.
So, I mean, was he known as a ufologist, by this time?
Yes. You've skipped some bits in the timeline there. So yes, he is there. His face is hidden. He uses a pseudonym, but they don't change his voice. So he is identifiable to those who know him and those who work with him.
Right,
Following
but he's not.
That, he's subject to threats. Has his tyres shot out on the freeway. So he takes the decision to come forward and publicly say, here I am, my name's actually Bob, it's not Dennis, this is what I look like. And he does so, he claims, as an insurance policy, because if he is then bumped off, that looks really dodgy.
Okay.
Then, yeah, he makes a stupid mistake and he sets up this brothel. I mean, God only knows why. I've heard a report that, you know, he was doing it to try and help these girls, and the interviews I've seen of him, I personally can see that, I can believe that. He seems like just a genuinely nice guy from what I interpret of him.
Okay.
But whether there's other motives, I don't know. And indeed, at that time, the usual punishment for that is a slap on the wrist and, you know, bit of community service. And he gets a much harsher fine. He has to go for psychological evaluations and all this kind of thing as a result of that.
Okay, Wikipedia says he was ordered to do 150 hours of community service, to stay away from brothels, and to undergo psychotherapy.
There you go. I mean, that's a much harsher penalty in of itself than is normally the case.
Is it?
I believe there were also financial, there were fines as well or something. I'm not 100% sure on that, but...
Couldn't he have gone to prison for pimping?
Yes. Yes, and this is the point. He stood there in court and they're saying, you are facing jail time if you don't come clean about your qualifications. And that's the point I'm trying to drive in there. Why would he not come forward at that point and just say, do you know what? Yeah, okay, here's the truth.
The truth that I was working at Area 51 on reverse engineering.
No, the truth, you know, if he'd made it up, if he'd made up his qualifications, I mean, because that was the key thing, nothing about Area 51 or S4 or any of that. His qualifications, that was his opportunity to come forward and say, do you know what, yeah, all right, you've caught me, you know.
Well, I admit that I don't have these qualifications.
He stuck to his guns. Yeah, he stuck to his guns and faced, he was being faced in jail time for that. But
if he'd have, all right, they say, you know, you're facing pimping charges, you're facing jail time. We'll do a deal with you. We'll reduce it to felony pandering, which carries a penalty of a certain number of hours of community service. But he thought, well, maybe if I come across as deluded, if I start ranting about these qualifications from institutions that will claim never to have heard of me, and talking about UFOs and reverse engineered extraterrestrial technology and Area 51, rather than jail, I'll get to see a psychiatrist.
But he'd already talked about these things long before this event.
Yeah, but by pleading, effectively, it's a way of pleading insanity by ranting on about UFOs.
No, but he'd already talked about the UFOs long before that event occurred.
Yeah, but I mean, to not go to jail for the pimping charges.
So he'd have to plan that he was going to get caught for pimping.
No, what I mean is once he was caught for pimping, once he was caught for pimping and was facing a prison sentence, his best way out of it would be to be referred for psychotherapy. Say, well, I did this because there's something wrong with me, and I'll hammer this home by talking about UFOs and in court and conspiracy theories, and people will say, well, yes, this guy's not. Let's not send him to prison. He's a bit deluded. Give him a bit of psychotherapy and a slap on the wrist, and tell him to stay away from brothels.
I'm really struggling to reconcile that with the guy I've seen on the interviews who is very clearly a very intelligent guy who would very clearly know that the best way out would just to be hold his hands up, take the slap on the wrist, and go about his life.
Would it? I mean...
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You look at comparative cases at the time, and that was the standard. So slap on the wrist, don't do it again, pay a bit of a fine, do a bit of community service, and you're on your way. But he didn't. He made things worse for himself by sticking to this story that he'd talked about years before. But all that to one side. So I mean, very clearly, I'm of the belief that his history was wiped by the government in order to discredit him. But the other thing that it effectively does, now we've been talking about this for a good quarter of an hour now, and we haven't really talked about his experiences taking apart UFOs, which is, you know, so it's a really effective strategy, if that's what it is, of distracting from what the man's about, from his story. Don't you think? Or it would be, if what I'm saying is right.
It would be, yeah. I mean, if when governments have secrets and someone goes and starts blabbing about them, I mean, most people don't. Most people know you shouldn't talk about secrets. I mean, I've worked in areas where we have access to very confidential.
Like what?
Which I'm not going to say. But for instance, you're travelling to work on the train and you're with a colleague, and obviously you've got a certain things to do that day. You don't discuss it on the train.
Of course.
Because there are people around. And it's not so much the fear that you will be overheard by an enemy agent or a spy or a terrorist or whatever, anyone who might make use of this information in a hostile way. It's that you'll be overheard by an off-duty police officer or someone else who happens to work at the place you're going to, which is quite likely, who will report you, and you'll be in big trouble and you'll lose your job. That's the fear. So, you know, you don't want... People usually have to have a strong motivation to betray secrets, like Chelsea Manning. I mean, Chelsea Manning was moved by a very strong motivation to basically reveal a lie, a very big lie that was being told to the American public.
But that's the point with Bob Lazar. He felt very strongly that the public needed to know about this, that they needed to know what was going on, and he felt so strongly that yes, he came forward and did it. Now he has since gone on record as saying, yeah, if I'd have known how much it would have destroyed my life, no, I probably wouldn't have done. I'd have probably kept my mouth shut.
But if he's this intelligent bloke, he would have known. He would have known, you know, the kind of people he was working for and what they would do if these secrets were betrayed. I mean, there must have been a certain amount of vetting done for him to be allowed to have this job. If you're working, you know, in this country, certainly, if you're going to work with classified materials, they will spy on you. They will interview your family and friends. They will find out what sort of person you are. I was interviewed by a psychiatrist, and I was interviewed by the chief vetting officer. And the vetting officers in this country have no interest in the nature of the work that you're going to do. So even if they're told, yeah, we really need this guy, he has important skills that we need to get used as quickly as possible. Can he get his vetting through? That will cut no ice with the vetting officer. They say, I don't care, and if I say so, he doesn't get clearance. Basically, we were interviewed by the vetting officer, who would usually be a retired senior police officer of sort of superintendent rank, and we were told that you go for your interview, you might give all the right answers to the questions. They're looking for certain things. You might give all the right answers, but if that guy gets a feeling about you that something just doesn't quite add up, something they can't quite put their finger on, you don't get cleared. Okay. That's the way it works in this country, and I don't imagine the United States are any less cagey.
Absolutely, and indeed, Bob talks about his experiences when he was interviewed for that role by EG&E. And we'll come on to them again in just a minute. But he does talk about that vetting process. But I've got to believe that an experience, because of course he wasn't told any of this at his interview, that you're going to be taking apart the propulsion system of alien spacecraft to figure out how it works. Of course he wouldn't have been told any of that until he gets there. And that sort of revelation, that sort of experience of everything you believe in, especially as a physicist, it's got to change you. So yes, he would have gone through the vetting, but there is no predicting how your eyes being opened, actual proof would change a person. It's got to change you. It's got to change you, because it fundamentally changes everything that you've believed in up to that point. But I get what you're saying, though.
As a scientist, though, with degrees in physics, a master's degree in physics, I mean, would he be that surprised to know that there's life beyond this planet?
Not that there's life beyond the planet, but that they've visited, that we have 9 of their spacecrafts in a hangar just up the road from here. That they're comprised of elements that don't appear on the periodic table. I mean, element 151 is a particular key part. I was going to say element, but key part of his story. He talked right from the word go about element 151, and he described its properties in detail, and it didn't exist. Now, years and decades later, we now know about element 151, and it matches. It matches his description. He talked at the time in 1989 about biometrics. When he went into the base, he had to place his hand on this metal plate that had pins in it that basically measured, or his understanding of it was that it measured the length of each of the bones in his hand, and it was talking about biometrics. And everybody told him this was absolutely ridiculous, that nothing like that existed in any government facility. 20 years later, it's revealed that at that time they were using these very devices on the stealth projects. For people to get into secure areas. And there is photographic evidence of these units exactly the way he described them back in 1989.
Could he have derived that story from science fiction? I'm not sure biometrics had appeared in science fiction before.
But how was he able to describe it in such accurate detail? Because it was a very detailed explanation he gave, and it matches perfectly.
Okay.
Both in the physical description of these things. I mean, they look exactly the way he described and the way he sketched them at the time, and the way in which they operate. Now, you would think biometrics back in science fiction in the 80s did read your fingerprints, or it'd be retina scans.
Yeah.
That was the thing. But he's talking about something that measures your bones. Well, that's, I would say, that's a little far-fetched for science fiction, But it turns out that's what actually was happening at the time.
Actually, the only biometric thing I can think of is it Moonraker, the Roger Moore James Bond film from late 70s, was it? And,
yes.
And they need to get this guy's eyeball so they can get through a. So they can
it wasn't Moonraker. It was the one that was remade into Never Say Never Again.
Thunderball. Thunderball.
What's right?
Thunderball,
yes. Because they had to change the guy's retina structure in his eye so it matched the president's. So they could steal the missiles.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. And that was quite far-fetched at the time. But but he's talking about a totally different thing again. So there is that. Element 1, sorry, I was saying it was element 151. It's element 115. My apologies. He talked, as you rightly said, about S4 being just south of Area 51. S4 is actually on Papoose Lake, whereas Area 51 is Groom Lake. He talked about S4, which nobody knew about at the time. He talked about EG&E as a company being used as basically a gateway to get to S4. So that's where any interviews were done. That's where people turned up to work and then they were bussed out and flown out to S4. And again, at that time, nobody knew anything. It was all top secret stuff. 20 years later, it all existed at the time. It's now a matter of public record that S4 is real. And EG&E was used as a gateway company.
I'm just thinking about his unwillingness to stay quiet about this kind of thing. I mean, when he was working at Area 51, this would have been in the 1980s, i.e. in the Cold War, which Ronald Reagan was heating up with his Star Wars initiative, strategic defence initiative. And it was a time of an arms race. So this would be a hell of a bad time for somebody to come out with and start talking about new technologies that the US government is working on.
I agree.
So, he could have been had for treason. He could have blabbing about a secret development of a secret propulsion system or weapon system. He's it's a very dangerous
I can see why he would want to hide his identity in the first time round and call himself Dennis. I mean, could have picked a better name, but
well,
apologies to any Dennises out there.
If he was an intelligent guy, as in, a guy who's got master's degrees from two prominent universities, he would know that whereas calling yourself Dennis and hiding behind a veil might disguise you to TV viewers, it wouldn't disguise you from the security services or the kinds of people you work for.
I struggle with that argument because you and I know many intelligent, very qualified people, and intelligence and common sense do not necessarily go hand in hand, and we know that.
That's true. Yeah, but he was working for these people. He would have known what they were capable of. Maybe he even encountered a case of a whistleblower being hunted down and destroyed while he was working on the job. Or maybe not. Maybe everyone else stayed in line.
Yeah, maybe he's totally unaware. I mean, he was also relatively young at the time, I mean, we're not talking about a guy who was in his 50s or anything like that. I forget how old he was.
Well, late 20s. He was in his 20s.
Late 20s.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's young. He's, Yeah, I can...
Well, in fact...
I can believe it.
He was very young to have had those qualifications.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
smart guy.
Yeah, very smart guy.
Now, you mentioned George Knapp, who is one of the investigative journalists that first broke the story. And George Knapp spent over a year investigating, talking to Lazar, interviewing him, following up on all the leads he possibly could. George Knapp, to this very day, remains an absolute believer in what Lazar has to say. Now, I've got to believe that George Knapp is far better at uncovering truths and such like than you or I.
It's his job.
Exactly. And if he remains an absolute believer, and he's done the research, he's done the investigation, he's spoken to Bob many, many times. How do you quantify that?
George will believe what he believes, I guess. And as you say, he's certainly looked into it harder and longer than I have. I'm just going on what I've been able to pick up in a relatively short space of time, which is basically Lazar's discredited claims regarding his employment, his qualifications, his criminal record, and so on. Now, in 1982, this article about his jet-powered car, which reportedly achieved speeds of 200 miles an hour. And this time it described him as a physicist at the Los Alamos Meson Physics Facility. So 1982, he would have been 22 or 23.
Okay.
So prior to that age, he's got these degrees. He's got these 2 master's degrees from MIT and Cal.
Yeah.
And he's gone and built this jet-powered car.
Well, he was building, so basically from high school, he was building as a hobby jet-powered cars in his back garden, basically, in his garage. So yeah, I can believe that and accept it.
Okay.
Now, it's not all hearsay and an opinion, because there's 2 more aspects to this that Bob has gone out of his way to try and prove this where he possibly can. Even though to this day, he tries to shun the whole UFO thing and put it all behind him because of the negative impact that it's had on his life.
Well, for most of his life, you think that he was a whiz kid in his 20s. Suddenly, at the age of 30, that's when he steps through the looking glass, I suppose it is. And it says Lazar admits that he has no evidence to support his core claim of alien technology.
Yeah.
So half his life he's been making this case. More 2/3 of his life he's been making this case with no evidence.
Yeah.
To support it.
He's remained utterly consistent throughout, which is usually where people who make these things up fall down. He's undergone hypnosis to recall some of the specifics about his experiences, and as a result, he's been able to recall details of the propulsion system and how it works in a gravity environment, and there's lots and lots of information out there about that. But particularly interesting to me is there were 4 occasions where he underwent polygraph tests. Now this is with serious senior polygraph analysts who then sent the results out to other polygraph analysts for a second opinion, and they came back that under questioning there was no attempt to deceive on his part. That's 4 separate tests analysed by at least 2 separate polygraph experts. No attempt to deceive. Now, if that doesn't tell me that the guy believes what he's saying, because that's what a polygraph is about. It's not about did it happen, it's about do you believe what you're saying. I think he absolutely does. And when you stack that up with, well, he described S4, he described EG&E long before it was known about, long before it was, decades before it was public knowledge, and then later we find out, oh yes, S4 did exist. I don't know, for me that's quite damning evidence. his qualifications are kind of a moot point, really. You know,
it's just strange. It's just strange that educational institutions would deny one of their stars. Really, someone who's got master's degrees from their institution.
Okay, and do you know what? Let's say, for argument's sake, that he made that whole thing up. But here's the thing: he's still describing, and let's say he made it up and got himself a job on a top secret program.
Yeah, but I mean, a university degree is a matter of public record, isn't it? Your graduates get published in the newspapers. You can't just get rid of college records. These are public records.
Are they published in newspapers in America, or were they back then?
I don't know. They certainly were in Britain at that time.
Okay, I'm trying to think. I don't think mine were ever in the papers. And that was not dissimilar time.
Yeah, certainly in the 80s.
A few years later than Bob Lazar, but...
Well, yeah, he would have been getting... Well, around the time he was playing with his jet-propelled car.
Well, just before, yeah. And let's come back on that one a moment. Los Alamos, would they have... or would the subcontractor who took him on have taken on someone without qualifications?
No.
In a job as a physicist?
No, but they claim not to have taken him on, so it's... Yeah.
But let's say the subcontractor that they used, would they have taken him on as a physicist working on a jet car, which, let's be fair, if you get that wrong and there's a big explosion and people die,
yeah,
you're not going to get a numpty to work on a job like that. So why was he employed in the first place if he didn't have these qualifications?
Well, I assume this jet car was something he was doing in his spare time, was he?
Well, he was making his own jet cars in his spare time.
Yeah.
But yes, he was. I mean, partly because of that, Los Alamos used him on this particular project to make a jet car. But that was his field of expertise, was propulsion.
Yeah. So, why would they erase his record that far back, but no further?
In order to discredit him.
Why not just disappear him altogether?
Because the man stood there, he obviously exists.
But people disappear all the time, don't they?
Well, yes, but bear in mind what he's just publicly come out and all of a sudden he is known to millions of people as the face of ufology, as the man who is blowing the whistle on the whole thing. If he were to suddenly disappear or die mysteriously in an accident, that would be taken as almost an admission by the government in what he's saying. If, however, they discredit him, if they say, well, look, the guy's got no qualifications, he's a nobody, he's making all this up, clearly, that's a much more effective method.
Well, someone who's been publicly discredited, that no one he claims to have worked for will back him up. The institutions where he's claimed to have got his university degrees disavow him completely. Wouldn't be surprising if someone like that committed suicide, would it?
I think there would still be a degree of suspicion.
Yeah, there's always suspicion. There's suspicion around Dr. David Kelly. There's suspicion around Gary Powers. There's suspicion around Mo Molam and Robin Cook. All these people who suddenly who were opposing a certain course of action by the government and then just suddenly mysteriously died.
There you go. But I think discrediting him is perhaps more effective.
And yet, here we are talking about him and giving credence, exploring what he said.
But that's the point. We're talking about him, and the first thing we talk about is these qualifications, which is not the big story. That's not the key thing to all of this, because I don't care if he was employed as a cleaner to go there and he's just bigging himself up and he saw these things and now he's talking about them. I'm not bothered. The key thing is that it's happening.
Yeah, we do have this propulsion. It was an antimatter propulsion system.
It was an anti-gravity, or it was a gravity drive that was powered by an antimatter power supply, basically.
A stable isotope of E115, which allegedly generates a gravity wave that allowed the vehicle to fly and to evade visual detection by bending light around it. Well, that's quite something to have in a Cold War. Scenario.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And he has gone in, following his hypnosis, where he was able to recall more details, he has gone into great detail to explain how there were 3 of these gravity emitters, and they were able to be used in kind of like almost like a low power mode, where 2 of them will be pointed downwards to keep it hovering, and another one will be angled such to propel it along. And if it wanted to travel a long distance, it would basically turn belly up, and then these 3 would focus in on its destination. It might be light years away, and it would distort space in order to travel these distances. Yeah, I mean, he's gone into incredible detail. Now, to be fair, L. Ron Hubbard went into incredible detail when he talks about the details of Scientology, which may or may not be the case. So the fact it's details, okay, that's not hard evidence. Fair enough. But to me, this is like one big jigsaw puzzle, and all right, there's a huge amount of pieces missing. But we've got the corners, we've got the edges, we've got, 3 or 4 fairly big chunks, and it's painting a hell of a picture.
It is. It's also, this was 30 years ago that he came out and talked about this technology that the government was working on, reverse engineered extraterrestrial technology. The US government hasn't made much progress in reverse engineering it, to the extent they're able to actually use it themselves, or else they have, but probably at the cost of billions of dollars. But they've created something which they can't use because they have to keep it a secret.
Or they've created something that they do use, but they still keep it a secret because they can.
But they're still having to cover its use by using basic 20th century technologies. They're still blasting rockets into space using solid fuel boosters rather than anti-gravity propulsion systems.
Well, if you had that technology and you wanted to keep it a secret, you wouldn't stop those other programs, because this needs to be progress needs to be seen to happen.
It does, but we're talking. I know you're talking decades with this kind of process, but you think, in virtually with the same amount of time, propeller-powered planes were replaced first by turboprops, or jet engines and turboprops. That's quite. Obviously the jet engine was a secret once. The rocket engine was a secret once. Yeah. These technologies are now in use, and we're still using we're putting rockets into space with Wernher von Braun's rocket technology, pretty much.
Yes, we are, and that should tell us something, that the internal combustion engine in a car has not changed in principle.
No.
Since Henry Ford.
It's
the same principle, and that's got to tell you there's something wrong with that. There is something fundamentally wrong with that, which okay, there's nothing conclusive, there's nothing evidential about this, but to me, that suggests that development of the existing technology has been diverted away to something else. We just don't know what it is.
But yeah, some things just, I don't know if it's a lack of interest or a lack of imagination, but something like when you're out and it starts raining and you put your umbrella up and it blows inside out and you get wet again. This in the 21st century. And then you see paintings of the 19th century or the 18th century where people are still having exactly that same problem with pretty much exactly the same kind of contraption. Why hasn't this moved on? Why haven't we found a better way to stop getting soaking wet?
But then you look at computers and the invention of the microchip. You know, we went from valves to this incredibly powerful system virtually overnight. And yeah, although there are, of course, allegations that the microchip technology has come from extraterrestrial usage. And maybe we'll talk about that in the future. But for today, Bob Lazar, then, let's summarise. I remain absolutely convinced that he's telling the truth. At very least, that he believes what he is saying and that there is truth behind it. What's your takeaway from this?
I think there are holes in his story. I think there are things that don't add up. I'm prepared to accept that it's a truthful account, but there's just some bits that I would like to know more about.
Okay,
including why we haven't seen any of this technology that they've supposedly been working on for so many years.
That sounds very reasonable and open-minded. But what do you think, listeners? Tweet us with your thoughts, your ideas, leave messages for us, all of that good stuff. And if there's anything that you would like us, any particular subjects that you would like us to discuss in future episodes, then do message us and let us know. Don't forget to join us next time, where we will be discussing the alien encounter during the Apollo 11 moon landing. Ooh, exciting stuff. So that's it from me, Stu.
And that's it from me, Neil. See you next time.
Aliens Explored is a Fecal Films production in association with Juicy Falls. Music by Darren Maffucci and editing by Stu Jackson. Find us on Twitter or Facebook by searching Aliens Explored, or visit us on aliensexplored.com.